He couldn't believe his eyes when the dusty 1937 Cadillac became his for a bargain price at the Detroit auction house. The vintage beauty, with its sleek lines and chrome details, promised to be the restoration project of a lifetime for a passionate mechanic like him. Little did he know that removing the front seats would reveal a secret that would change everything about this seemingly innocent purchase. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. Brian grabbed his crowbar and wrench, sweat beading on his brow as he worked to free the seat. The vintage Cadillac had been sitting in his garage for 3 days now, taunting him with its secrets. He'd bought it on a whim at the county auction, drawn to its sleek lines and forgotten history. Something about the way the seat had been reupholstered years ago didn't sit right with him. The stitching was too tight, the padding too firm compared to factory specs. "Come on, you stubborn thing," he muttered, jamming the crowbar deeper into the seam where the bench seat met the frame. With a sudden, echoing crack that reverberated through the empty garage, the bench finally gave way. Brian stumbled backward, nearly dropping his tools as the seat lifted to reveal something impossible, a cavity beneath that shouldn't have existed. His calloused hands trembled slightly as he set his tools aside and knelt closer. The factory floor pan had been modified, cut and welded to create a hidden compartment nearly 6 inches deep. His heart pounded against his ribs as his fingertips brushed over 2 battered leather satchels tucked neatly inside, their scent of old earth and oil rising in the air. What the hell?" he whispered to the empty garage. The leather was cracked with age, the brass buckles tarnished almost black. Brian glanced toward the garage door, suddenly aware of how exposed he felt, despite being alone. With careful movements, he lifted the first satchel. It was surprisingly heavy, the weight shifting inside like solid objects rather than papers or clothing. The second bag was heavier still. His breath caught in his throat as the significance of his find began to dawn on him. Cars like this, from that era, they were sometimes used to transport things people wanted hidden, valuable things, dangerous things. Brian's phone buzzed in his pocket, making him jump. It was his buddy Mike from the auction house. "Hey, man," Mike's voice crackled through the speaker. "You'll never believe who's been asking about that Cadillac you bought. Some serious-looking guys in suits. Said they represented the former owner's estate, offering serious cash." A chill ran down Brian's spine as he stared at the satchels. "How serious?" he asked, his voice suddenly hoarse. "Like triple what you paid," Mike replied. "They seemed pretty desperate to get it back. Something about family, sentimental value." Brian's fingers tightened around the worn leather handle. "Tell them it's not for sale," he said firmly, already wondering what he'd gotten himself into. At least, not yet. He fumbled open the first satchel, his calloused fingers clumsy with anticipation. The worn leather crackled slightly as he peeled back the flap, releasing a musty scent that spoke of decades past. Nestled inside were sepia-toned photographs, their edges curled and yellowed with age. The faces staring up at him from another time seemed to watch him with knowing eyes, men in stiff collars and women with Gibson girl hairstyles, their formal poses betraying nothing of their secrets. Alongside the photos lay stacks of brittle letters, the handwriting flowing and elegant in a way people didn't write anymore, carefully tied with faded blue ribbon that threatened to disintegrate at his touch. But it was the velvet pouch, heavy and clinking, that made Brian's mind race. The fabric had once been rich burgundy, now worn to a dull rust color at the seams. He loosened the drawstring with trembling hands and tilted the pouch over the workbench. His breath caught as he poured out a cascade of gold pocket watches and sparkling jewelry, the kind that hadn't seen daylight in generations. A gentleman's watch with an ornate chain, its face still ticking faintly, as if it had been waiting for this moment. Diamond earrings that caught the workshop's fluorescent lights and scattered them like tiny rainbows across the concrete floor. A woman's pearl necklace, each orb glowing with a soft luster that seemed impossible after so many years hidden away. "Jesus," Brian whispered, picking up a heavy gold ring with a blood-red stone. It was warm in his palm, as if it had absorbed the heat of its previous owner, rather than the cold of the Cadillac's frame. He turned it over, noticing an inscription inside the band, letters worn but still legible. The weight of the jewelry alone would be worth thousands. But something told him these pieces weren't just valuable, they were significant, personal, perhaps even dangerous to possess. He glanced over his shoulder at the garage door, suddenly aware of how exposed he felt. The satchels had been hidden for a reason, and now that reason was spread across his workbench like buried treasure. Brian's hands trembled as he carefully unfolded the first yellowed letter. The paper was delicate, threatening to crumble at his touch. The handwriting was elegant but hurried, dated June 17th, 1932. "My dearest Margaret," it began. "The bank took our farm today. I couldn't face telling the children." Brian swallowed hard, feeling like an intruder in someone's private grief. Letter after letter revealed the story of the Caldwell family, ordinary people caught in extraordinary times. There was Thomas, the father, writing to his wife while searching for work in Chicago. Margaret, responding with news of how she'd managed to feed their 4 children on almost nothing. Mentions of their oldest son enlisting to send money home. A daughter postponing college dreams to work at a local diner. "God, this is heavy stuff," Brian muttered, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. The garage suddenly felt too quiet, too sacred for the ordinary sounds of wrenches and metal. These weren't just old papers. They were someone's entire world. One envelope contained 3 worn photographs. A proud couple standing before a modest farmhouse, children lined up by height on wooden steps, and later, the same family looking thinner but smiling beside the very Cadillac now sitting in his garage. On the back, in faded pencil, "Our new start, 1939. Brian spread everything across his workbench, creating a timeline of struggle and resilience. The letters spoke of selling prized possessions, of neighbors helping neighbors, of Christmas celebrations with homemade gifts. The final letter, dated 1941, mentioned hiding their emergency fund somewhere safe, where only family would think to look. "Holy shit," Brian whispered, the realization dawning. The seats. They hid something in the actual seats. He glanced back at the Cadillac with new understanding. This wasn't just a car. It was a time capsule. A family's entire legacy preserved in leather and steel. Brian sat back on his stool, suddenly overwhelmed by responsibility. What should he do with this history? Who were the rightful owners now? And was there more to find? The thought made his heart race. After all these years, he might be the first person to uncover whatever the Caldwell family had hidden away as their last resort during America's darkest economic hour. His conscience gnawed at him with every passing minute. The money was a fortune, more than he'd ever seen at once, but Brian couldn't shake the feeling that taking it would be wrong. These weren't just forgotten bills. This was someone's life savings, hidden away for safekeeping. He had to know to whom these treasures belonged and why they'd been left behind. The question haunted him as he paced around his garage, occasionally glancing at the cardboard box where he'd temporarily stored the cash and jewelry. This isn't finders keepers," he muttered to himself. "Someone out there is missing this." After a restless night, Brian dug through the auction paperwork he'd filed away. The car had come from an estate liquidation company that handled foreclosures and property clearances. A few calls and some persuasive talking later, he managed to get a name and contact number for the previous owner, information they weren't supposed to share, but his earnest explanation had swayed the clerk. The name on the file was Evelyn Grant. Brian rehearsed what he would say before dialing, his palms sweaty as he punched in the numbers. After 3 rings, a woman answered, her voice thin and cautious. Hello, Mrs. Grant. My name is Brian Donovan. I recently purchased your Cadillac at auction, and I found something inside that I think belongs to you." There was a long pause on the line. "What kind of scam is this?" Her voice hardened with suspicion. "I've already lost enough, young man." "No scam, Mum, I promise. I'm a mechanic from Wilson's Auto. I bought the Cadillac last week, and when I removed the seats to restore the upholstery, I found— You found it." The suspicion in her voice instantly transformed into disbelief. "You actually found it? The package is still there?" Brian felt a wave of relief. "Yes, Ma'am. Everything's here, untouched. I'd like to return it to you. If you could verify what's inside." Her breathing became audible through the phone. $57,000 and my mother's diamond necklace," she whispered, her voice breaking. "It was all I had left after Richard died. I hid it there when the bank started foreclosure proceedings. I was going to retrieve it, but they came for the car so suddenly. I've been beside myself for weeks." Evelyn's hands trembled as she sank into the chair Brian had pulled out for her. The weight of his words hung in the air between them, each name he'd read from those yellowed letters striking her like a physical blow. Her grandfather's elegant, sloping script. She would recognize it anywhere, even decades after his passing. The way he formed his capital letters with that distinctive flourish at the end. It was like seeing a ghost materialize before her eyes. "My grandfather," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "Samuel Harding, was what folks back then called a proper gentleman." She dabbed at her eyes with a tissue Brian had silently offered. "He owned Harding's fine jewelry on Woodward Avenue, right in the heart of Detroit. Been in the family since 1908. The memories seemed to strengthen her voice. When the Depression hit, it hit hard. Banks were folding left and right. People were losing everything overnight. Brian nodded, leaning forward slightly, his expression a mixture of fascination and concern. "Grandpa Samuel was clever, though," Evelyn continued, a hint of pride breaking through her emotion. "He didn't trust the banks anymore. Who could blame him? So he started hiding his most valuable pieces." She gestured toward the satchels, the truly irreplaceable inventory, family heirlooms people had reluctantly sold him, pieces he couldn't bear to part with. He needed somewhere safe, somewhere nobody would think to look. "The Cadillac," Brian murmured. "That car was his pride and joy," Evelyn confirmed with a watery smile. "He'd drive it to church on Sundays, polishing it every Saturday without fail. Nobody would think to look under the seats of a car that never left his sight." Her fingers traced invisible patterns on the table. "He told my grandmother about it, of course, but nobody else. Not even my father knew." She paused, her brow furrowing. "But then Grandpa Samuel had his stroke in 39. He never recovered enough to speak clearly again." Brian's eyes widened with understanding. "And the secret died with him. The family knew he'd hidden valuables somewhere, but nobody could figure out where. The store inventory was accounted for, the house was searched. But the Cadillac—" Evelyn's voice trailed off. "It was sold after his death. My grandmother couldn't bear to look at it anymore. Said it reminded her too much of him. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from." Evelyn's eyes grew distant as she clutched her coffee mug tighter. "There's something I haven't told you about my family," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My grandfather, William, didn't just die. He vanished without a trace in 1943. One day he went to work at the shipyard, and he never came home." She paused, collecting herself. "My grandmother reported him missing, but it was wartime. The police investigation went nowhere. Some thought he'd abandoned the family. Others suspected foul play, but we never knew." I felt a chill despite the warm diner. The implications were starting to form a disturbing picture. "The disappearance destroyed my grandmother," Evelyn continued. "She raised my father alone, always waiting for William to walk through that door again. She never remarried, never even dated. It was like she was frozen in 1943, waiting for answers that never came. She took a sip of her coffee, her hand trembling slightly. The Cadillac was purchased new by my grandfather in 1942. After he vanished, my grandmother couldn't bear to sell it. It was the last big thing they'd bought together. So she put it in storage, paid the fees religiously every month until she died in 1978. And no one ever thoroughly checked the car, I asked, though I already knew the answer. Evelyn shook her head. It became this family relic. My father inherited it but kept it stored. He'd visit sometimes, just to sit in it and feel close to the father he barely remembered. When Dad passed last year, I inherited everything, including the storage fees. I decided it was finally time to let it go. Her voice cracked. I never thought who would think to look under the seats. All these years, the weight of what she was saying hung between us. 60 years that car had been sitting in storage, potentially holding the answer to a family tragedy the entire time. Do you think... I couldn't finish the question. I don't know what to think, she whispered, but I need to know the truth, no matter how painful. My family deserves that much. Brian couldn't shake the emotion in Evelyn's voice as she spoke about her grandfather. Something in her story resonated with him on a deeply human level. Would you like to see the items yourself? He offered gently. They're still at my garage. Maybe holding them might bring back some memories. Evelyn hesitated for just a moment before agreeing, her voice catching slightly as she thanked him for his kindness. The following afternoon, Brian led Evelyn through the cluttered workspace to the corner where he'd carefully arranged the treasures from the Cadillac. The afternoon sun streamed through the dusty windows, casting golden light across the workbench. Evelyn's hands trembled as she reached for the first pocket watch, her fingers tracing the intricate engravings on its case. This was his favorite, she whispered, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. He would take it out after Sunday dinner and let me listen to the ticking. She picked up each piece of jewelry with reverent care, sharing snippets of memories with each one. A birthday gift here, a Christmas surprise there. Brian stood back, giving her space to reconnect with these tangible pieces of her past. As they carefully sorted through the collection, Evelyn's hand brushed against something wedged deeper in the pile of items Brian had extracted from the seat. Wait, what's this? She pulled at the corner of what appeared to be a small tin box that had been tucked into the deepest part of the seat frame, somewhere Brian had initially missed during his first inspection. The box was no larger than a paperback book, its surface tarnished with age. Despite years of being hidden away, the initials E.M. remained clearly visible on the lid, engraved in an elegant script. Evelyn gasped, her fingers flying to her mouth. Those are my grandfather's initials, Edward Montgomery. She turned the box over in her hands, discovering a small keyhole on one side. It was locked tight, the mechanism showing no signs of yielding after decades of disuse. Brian watched as Evelyn's expression shifted from surprise to intense curiosity. Whatever secrets this box contained had been deliberately hidden away, preserved in the heart of the Cadillac all these years, waiting to be discovered. I had no idea this existed, Evelyn said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. What could he have possibly kept locked away that was so important? With a trembling hand, Brian pried open the box. The metal hinges creaked in protest, as if reluctant to reveal secrets kept hidden for decades. Emily and Sarah huddled closer, their breath collectively held as the lid finally gave way. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, lay 3 items that seemed ordinary, yet somehow ominous in their simplicity. A set of tarnished brass keys, a yellowed map of the city with several locations circled in faded red ink, and a folded note. "This is Dad's handwriting," Sarah whispered, reaching for the note with reverent fingers. The paper was brittle, threatening to crumble at the edges as she carefully unfolded it. The 3 of them leaned in, reading the words penned in Samuel's distinctive, slanted script. "For those I love, when the time is right." Emily's hand flew to her mouth. "What does it mean? When the time is right for what?" Brian studied the map, his mechanic's eyes naturally drawn to the precision of the markings. "These circles aren't random. Look, this one's the old warehouse district, and this one—" He paused, tapping a particularly prominent circle. "This is where we found the Cadillac at auction." "The keys," Sarah said suddenly, picking them up. "They're not car keys. Too old, too small." She turned them over in her palm, the metal warm against her skin. "Maybe a safety deposit box, or a storage unit." Emily shook her head, confusion etched across her features. "But why hide this? Why not just tell us?" "Because someone didn't want him to," Brian replied, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Remember those men who came asking questions after he disappeared? Maybe Dad was protecting us by keeping us in the dark." The cryptic message hung in the air between them, a puzzle piece that somehow made the picture less clear rather than more. Was this Samuel's attempt to communicate from beyond, a breadcrumb trail leading to answers about his disappearance? Or was it something else entirely, a final riddle from a man who'd always loved challenging his family to think deeper? "We need to check these locations," Emily decided. Her earlier fear transforming into determination, starting tomorrow. They spent hours hunched over the worn map, their fingers tracing the faded red markings that crisscrossed the yellowed paper. Brian had brought it to Evelyn's kitchen table, where the afternoon light streamed through lace curtains, illuminating dust motes that danced between them. The neighborhood marked on the map had transformed dramatically over the decades. Old factories converted to luxury apartments. Corner stores replaced by coffee shops with names like Grind and Daily Brew. "This whole area was different back then," Evelyn murmured, adjusting her reading glasses. "My grandmother used to talk about the cannery that employed half the town, and the dance hall where she met my grandfather." Her weathered finger stopped at a particular intersection, tapping gently. "But this address, this one, rings a bell." Brian leaned closer, squinting at the circled location. "Wood 47 Blackwood Street." "Yes," Evelyn nodded, her eyes distant with recollection. "There was an old building there, 3 stories, red brick with those ornate cornices. My mother always told me to stay away from it as a child, said it housed people with secrets." She chuckled softly. "Of course, that only made me more curious." Brian pulled out his phone, quickly searching the address. "It's still there, but it looks abandoned now. Property records show it's been vacant for nearly 15 years. Evelyn's eyes widened. After all this time, could this be where the money was hidden, where the final pieces of this puzzle might come together? They exchanged a look charged with anticipation and uncertainty. The connection between a decades-old Cadillac, a hidden fortune, and this mysterious building seemed tenuous at best, but it was the only lead they had. "We should go there," Brian said. "Already standing? Right now, before it gets dark?" Evelyn hesitated only briefly before reaching for her coat. "I'll drive. I still remember the old shortcuts." As they headed for the door, Brian felt a flutter of nervous energy. They were chasing ghosts and whispers, following a trail that had remained hidden for half a century. What would they find at 47 Blackwood Street? Empty rooms and graffiti-covered walls? Or something that would explain why someone had gone to such lengths to conceal whatever had been hidden in that Cadillac's seats? The engine of Evelyn's modest sedan hummed to life as they pulled away from the curb, heading toward a past that refused to stay buried. Brian's heart pounded in his chest as he stood before the dilapidated storefront. The once proud brick building was now a shadow of its former self, with ivy creeping up its weathered facade and windows that had long ago surrendered to vandals, stones. The rusted sign hanging precariously above read Harmon's Hardware, though most of the letters had faded beyond recognition. "Are you sure about this?" Sarah whispered, her breath visible in the chilly morning air. "This place looks like it might collapse if we sneeze too hard." Brian nodded, fishing the small brass key from the tin box they'd found beneath the Cadillac seat. Despite its age, the key gleamed as if recently polished. He approached the door, pushing aside debris that had accumulated on the threshold, and slid the key into the lock. To his astonishment, it turned with a smooth, well-oiled click. "That's unexpected," he muttered, pushing the door open with a creak that echoed through the abandoned street. The interior was a time capsule. Dust particles swirled in shafts of light that streamed through the broken windows, illuminating ancient shelving units still stocked with merchandise from decades past. The floor creaked beneath their cautious steps as they ventured deeper into the forgotten space. "Look at all this," Sarah said, running her finger along a counter thick with dust. "It's like everyone just walked out one day and never came back." Brian felt a strange sensation, as if the building itself was watching them. Following the hand-drawn map from the documents, he made his way toward the back room. The door was unlocked, swinging open to reveal a small office space with a desk and filing cabinet. "According to these notes, there should be something behind that wall," he said, examining the faded wallpaper on the far side of the room. Sarah approached the wall, tapping it gently. "It sounds hollow." Brian ran his fingers along the edges until he felt a slight depression. Pressing it, a section of the wall clicked and swung inward, revealing a hidden compartment. There, embedded in the exposed brick, was a steel safe, untouched for what must have been decades. "My God," Sarah whispered. "It's really here." Brian stared at the safe, its dial catching a ray of sunlight. "This is what Old Man Harmon was protecting. Whatever's in there is what got him killed." He reached for the combination they'd found encoded in the documents, his fingers trembling slightly as he turned the dial. Left, right, left again. The mechanism inside was as smooth as the door lock had been. Evelyn's hands trembled as she tried the remaining keys, each one clicking uselessly against the lock, until finally the fifth key slid in smoothly. She held her breath as she turned it, rewarded with a satisfying click that echoed in the garage. The safe door creaked open on hinges that hadn't moved in decades, releasing the faint smell of old paper and forgotten secrets. "My God," she whispered, peering inside. The interior was neatly organized with stacks of leather-bound ledgers, their spines cracked with age. Behind them, more family photographs were carefully preserved in manila envelopes, showing faces similar to those in the album they'd already found. But what caught her eye immediately was a thick bundle of cash wrapped in yellowed newspaper, the date still visible in faded ink. March 15th, 1942. Brian leaned in beside her, his shoulder touching hers as they both stared at the contents. "That's a lot of money to keep hidden away," he murmured, carefully lifting the bundle. The bills were crisp $50 notes, preserved perfectly by the dry air inside the safe. He estimated there must be several $1,000s, a fortune in 1942. Why wouldn't someone put this in a bank? Evelyn wondered aloud, reaching for one of the ledgers. As she pulled it out, a folded paper slipped from between the pages, fluttering to the concrete floor. Brian bent to retrieve it, unfolding what appeared to be an official document. As the paper opened fully under the workshop lights, his expression changed dramatically. "Evelyn," he said, his voice suddenly tight, "look at this." She glanced over, then froze. In her hands was a wanted poster, the kind she'd only ever seen in old Western movies. But this was real. The paper, authentic. The ink faded but still legible. The face staring back at them was unmistakably a younger version of Samuel Harding, the same distinctive jawline, the same penetrating eyes they'd seen in the family photographs. Brian's blood ran cold as he read the text aloud. Wanted, Samuel Harding, for questioning regarding the theft of $50,000 and subsequent disappearance following the collapse of First National Bank of Chicago, 1941. "The car," Evelyn whispered, making the connection immediately. The money to buy it, the reason it was hidden away, and why nobody ever reported it missing, Brian finished, his mind racing. Samuel Harding wasn't just hiding his prized Cadillac, he was hiding himself. The realization hit Evelyn like a wave, causing her to slump back against the leather sofa in Brian's living room. Her grandfather hadn't just hidden his valuables, he'd been running from something or someone. The old newspaper clippings, the coded letters, the hasty departure from Chicago, it all painted a picture of a man in hiding, not just a cautious immigrant protecting his assets. "My entire family has been living under this shadow without even knowing it," she whispered, staring at the documents spread across the coffee table. "All those years my mother spent wondering why he was so secretive, why he never talked about the old days. The shame and secrecy, it's haunted us for 3 generations. Brian sat beside her, his mechanic's hands surprisingly gentle as he gathered the scattered papers. "We don't know that he did anything wrong, Evelyn. People had all sorts of reasons to hide their tracks back then, especially immigrants. But what if he was involved in something terrible? What if that's why he buried everything in that car?" Her voice cracked. "What if the money itself is—" "Stop!" Brian interrupted firmly. "Your grandfather worked hard his entire life. That much is clear from everything you've told me. We can't jump to conclusions based on a few old papers and some hidden cash." Evelyn wiped away a tear. "Then what do we do?" Brian's expression shifted to one of determination. "We dig deeper. There's more to this story. And we owe it to Samuel to uncover the truth." He pointed to a name that appeared repeatedly in the documents. "This Thomas Blackwell keeps coming up. He was clearly important." "You really want to help me with this?" Evelyn asked, surprised by his investment in her family mystery. "Look, I'm the one who found this stuff. I feel responsible." He paused, meeting her eyes. "Plus, I've always been a sucker for a good mystery." For the first time that day, Evelyn smiled. "Where do we start? Chicago Public Library has archives going back to the 1920s. We could check property records, business registries, and these bank statements. They might lead somewhere." Brian's enthusiasm was contagious. "If your grandfather was innocent, we'll find evidence to clear his name. If not," he shrugged, "at least you'll have the truth." Evelyn nodded slowly, gathering strength. The truth. After all these years. That's what matters most. She reached for her phone. "I should call my mother. She deserves to know what we've found so far." Brian stood up. "I'll make coffee. Something tells me we're in for a long night." As they pored over the yellowed pages, a story of betrayal began to emerge from the faded ink. Evelyn and Jack spent hours arranging the documents chronologically, their fingers tracing the elegant script that chronicled Samuel's downfall. The ledgers revealed substantial investments in a mining venture with his business partner Charles Macmillan, a man Samuel had described in earlier letters as "my dearest friend and most trusted confidant." But the tone changed dramatically in later entries. "Look at this," Jack whispered, pointing to an entry from spring of 1893. Samuel withdrew his entire savings to bail Charles out of financial trouble. Evelyn nodded grimly. And here, 6 months later, Charles accused Samuel of embezzling from their shared accounts. She picked up another letter, her voice catching. Samuel writes that Charles fabricated evidence, even paid witnesses to testify against him. The documents painted a heartbreaking picture. Charles had methodically framed Samuel, using their friendship to gain his trust before destroying his reputation. When Samuel discovered that Charles had been siphoning money to cover gambling debts, Charles struck first, turning the community against Samuel. "This is why he was running," Jack said softly. "He wasn't fleeing from justice. He was fleeing from injustice." Evelyn's eyes filled with tears as she unfolded Samuel's final letter to his wife. written from a hotel room the night before he disappeared. His handwriting was shaky, desperation evident in every hurried stroke. "My dearest Elizabeth," she read aloud, "I cannot bear the shame they have heaped upon our name, though I am innocent. Charles has turned all against me. I must leave to find evidence that will clear my name. Keep faith, my love. I shall return to you. I swear it on my very soul." Jack placed his hand gently on Evelyn's shoulder as she wiped away tears. "He never made it back to her," he murmured. "No wonder he hid the money," Evelyn said. "He wasn't stealing, he was protecting what was rightfully his from Charles." She gathered the papers carefully, her heart aching for a man she'd never met. Samuel died alone, believing history would remember him as a thief when he was actually the victim. Jack nodded solemnly. "And now, over a century later, we're the only ones who know the truth." Driven by both justice and curiosity, Brian and Evelyn spent the next 3 days combing through old phone books, property records, and social media platforms. Their search for descendants of Charles Macmillan proved challenging, but Brian's connections in the automotive community finally paid off when an old-timer at the Classic Car Club remembered a Macmillan family that had been prominent in the city's history. "If we're going to get answers about Samuel and what happened to him, these people might be our only shot," Brian said as they pulled up to a gleaming office building downtown. The Macmillan Development Group occupied the top 3 floors, a testament to the family's continued prosperity. Evelyn smoothed her blouse nervously. What if they don't want to talk about it? Family secrets this old are usually kept buried for a reason. "Then we'll know we're onto something," Brian replied, his mechanic's hands looking out of place against the polished chrome of the elevator buttons. They were escorted through a maze of modern offices until they reached a corner suite with floor-to-ceiling windows. David Macmillan, a man in his early 60s with silver hair and an expensive suit, greeted them with practiced charm that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You mentioned on the phone this was about a Cadillac," he asked, gesturing for them to sit in leather chairs that probably cost more than Brian's monthly mortgage payment. Brian nodded. "A 1957 Eldorado Brougham that belonged to your grandfather, Charles. We found some unusual modifications. My grandfather owned many cars," David said dismissively. "That was before my time." Evelyn leaned forward. "We also found evidence connecting the car to a man named Samuel Jefferson. The change was subtle, but unmistakable." David's smile froze, and a slight pallor crept across his tanned face. His fingers tightened around his pen until the knuckles turned white. "I'm not familiar with that name," he said, but the slight tremor in his voice betrayed him. "That's odd," Brian pressed, "because we have documentation showing your grandfather and Samuel were business partners in '57, right before Samuel disappeared." David abruptly stood up. "I'm afraid I have another appointment. My secretary can show you out." As they were being escorted away, Evelyn noticed David immediately pick up his phone, his face tense with urgency. "He's hiding something," she whispered to Brian as they stepped into the elevator. "Did you see how he reacted when we mentioned Samuel's name?" Brian nodded grimly. Whatever happened 60 years ago, the Macmillans are still protecting the secret. And now they know we're looking. David's shoulders slumped as the weight of decades of family secrets finally became too heavy to bear. With his voice barely above a whisper, he began to unravel the truth that had been buried for nearly 60 years. "My grandfather wasn't the hero we all thought he was," he admitted, his eyes fixed on the floor. "He embezzled a significant amount of money from the bank, where he and Samuel worked together. When the discrepancies were discovered, he carefully planted evidence that pointed to Samuel instead." The room fell silent as David continued, each word seemingly painful to pronounce. "The stolen money," It was used to start our family's construction business. Everything we have, our entire family fortune, was built on that initial theft and the terrible lie that destroyed Samuel's life." His voice cracked. My father suspected the truth, but chose to look the other way. I found letters in his study after he died, correspondence between him and my grandfather that hinted at what really happened. Evelyn sat perfectly still, tears streaming down her face. The anger she had carried for decades was transforming into something else, a strange, unexpected sense of peace. After 60 years of wandering, of living with the shadow of injustice hanging over her family, the truth had finally emerged into the light. "All this time," she whispered, "all these years of suffering and separation between our families because of one man's greed and cowardice." Samuel's old pocket watch seemed to tick louder in the silence that followed. The revelation had sent shockwaves through both families gathered in the room. Michael placed his hand on his grandmother's shoulder, while Lisa stared at her husband with a mixture of shock and disappointment. The Harrington family legacy, which David had been so proud of, now appeared tarnished beyond repair. For the Coles, the vindication came far too late to heal all wounds, but it offered something they had never truly had: closure. "What happens now?" Michael finally asked. Breaking the heavy silence, Evelyn straightened her back, wiping away her tears. "Now, we stop living in the past. The truth doesn't change what happened, but it changes everything about how we move forward." She looked directly at David. "Your grandfather stole more than money. He stole my father's reputation, his freedom, and ultimately years of his life. But I refuse to let this hatred continue poisoning another generation." With the mystery finally unraveling, Brian and Evelyn drove back to his garage in contemplative silence. The setting sun cast long shadows across the road, much like the shadows of the past that had been illuminated by their discovery. When they pulled up to the workshop, the Cadillac sat waiting, its elegant lines now seeming less like a vehicle and more like a vessel, a time capsule that had carried Samuel's secrets across decades. "It's strange to think how it all started," Evelyn said, running her hand along the Cadillac's hood. "Just you, cursing at a stubborn bench seat that wouldn't budge." Brian chuckled. "If that seat had come out easily, we'd never have found any of it. Samuel must have known exactly what he was doing when he modified that compartment." They stood before the car, now understanding its true value went far beyond its collector price tag. After much discussion over coffee in Brian's cluttered office, they reached a decision about the treasures. "These aren't just objects," Evelyn said firmly. "They're pieces of history, Samuel's history, my family's history. They deserve to be preserved properly." Brian nodded. "The local historical museum would give the photographs and letters a proper home. They have that special section on local families during the war era." "And the jewelry?" Brian asked, looking at the delicate pieces that had once adorned Eliza's neck and wrists. "I'll share them among the families," Evelyn decided. "My cousins should each have something to remember their grandparents by. Samuel would have wanted his treasures to bring the family together, not cause disputes." They agreed that the Cadillac itself would remain with Brian. After all, he had been the one to rescue it from obscurity at the auction. But now it would be restored with an understanding of its significance, preserving the secret compartment as a tribute to Samuel's ingenuity. "You know," Brian said, closing the Cadillac's door gently, "in all my years of restoration work, I've never encountered a car with such a story." "And to think," Evelyn smiled, "we're probably the first people to know the full story since Samuel himself." Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The media storm hit like a hurricane. Within 48 hours of the discovery, Brian's modest garage had become the epicenter of Detroit's attention. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes pointed skyward like mechanical flowers seeking the sun. Local reporters thrust microphones toward anyone who'd been remotely connected to the Cadillac, hungry for quotes and color. "I just wanted to restore a classic car," Brian told the Detroit Free Press, shaking his head in disbelief as cameras flashed. "I never imagined I'd be part of some buried treasure story." The papers dubbed it the Cadillac Fortune, and social media buzzed with theories about the original owner and how the money had remained undiscovered for decades. Evelyn, initially reluctant to step into the spotlight, found herself embracing her unexpected celebrity status. She appeared on morning shows, recounting how she'd nearly passed on the auction entirely. "My father always said every car has a story," she'd tell the cameras with a warm smile. "I just never expected this one to have such an extraordinary chapter." Between interviews and photo shoots, Brian and Evelyn spent evenings in the garage working on the Cadillac's restoration. Their hands moved methodically over chrome and steel, their conversation flowing as naturally as the polish they applied to the vintage dashboard. "You know what's funny?" Brian said one night, wiping grease from his hands. "Before all this, I was feeling burned out, just fixing commuter cars one after another. This old beauty reminded me why I fell in love with automobiles in the first place." Evelyn nodded, understanding perfectly. "My father used to say cars aren't just transportation, they're time capsules. Every dent has a story, every worn seat cushion held someone's life for a while." As autumn settled over Detroit, the media attention gradually faded. But something more valuable remained. Brian found himself looking forward to Evelyn's visits, their shared enthusiasm for the Cadillac evolving into a friendship neither had expected. They'd discovered something more meaningful than money, a connection built on shared passion and unexpected adventure. "When this is finished," Brian said, running his hand along the Cadillac's gleaming fender, "we should take her for a proper road trip." Evelyn smiled. "I'd like that. After all, what good is restoring history if you don't make some new history with it?" Months later, Brian stood back and admired his handiwork. The Cadillac gleamed in the late afternoon sun, its cherry-red paint job catching the light like liquid fire. Every chrome detail had been polished to mirror-like perfection. The interior, once a crime scene, now smelled of fresh leather and possibility. He ran his hand along the smooth curve of the hood, still amazed at how this car had changed everything. His phone buzzed with a text from Evelyn. "Don't forget, family barbecue starts at 5. Everyone's excited to see you." And the car. Brian smiled. The Thompsons had become like family to him over these past months. What had started as returning a treasured possession had blossomed into something he never expected. He slid behind the wheel and started the engine, which purred with a deep, satisfied rumble. When he pulled into the driveway of Evelyn's suburban home, children ran to admire the car, while adults gathered around with appreciative whistles. Evelyn emerged from the crowd, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Dad would have loved to see it like this," she said, running her fingers along the dashboard. "You've given us back more than just a car." As the evening progressed, Brian found himself surrounded by 3 generations of Thompsons, sharing stories over paper plates piled high with barbecue. Someone had brought out old photo albums, and Brian marveled at pictures of Robert Thompson standing proudly beside the same Cadillac, decades younger but unmistakable. Under the string lights in Evelyn's backyard, watching her grandchildren chase fireflies, Brian realized how profoundly his life had transformed. 6 months ago, he'd been a lonely mechanic with nothing but his garage. Now he had this extended family, a purpose beyond fixing engines, and a renewed faith in justice. The Cadillac sat in the driveway, catching the last rays of sunset on its polished surface. It was no longer a vessel of secrets and sorrow, but a testament to persistence and truth. What had begun with a horrifying discovery beneath worn upholstery had ended with healing for a family who'd waited decades for answers. As stars appeared overhead, Brian raised his glass in a silent toast to Robert Thompson. The car had finally fulfilled its purpose, not just as transportation, but as a time capsule preserving truth until the right person came along to uncover it. Some treasures, Brian now understood, were meant to be found exactly when they needed to be. The Cadillac's engine didn't just start, it sang, a symphony of mechanical precision that had waited patiently for decades to perform once more. Brian stepped back, wiping grease from his hands as Evelyn slid behind the wheel, her fingers trembling slightly as they gripped the restored steering wheel. The dashboard gleamed with its original dials and gauges, each one meticulously cleaned and calibrated during the restoration process. Through the windshield, Brian could see her lips moving, whispering something to the spirit of the car, or perhaps to her grandfather. "He would have loved this moment," she said, loud enough for Brian to hear over the purring engine. Seeing his Cadillac breathe again. The afternoon sun caught the fresh coat of paint, making the vintage automobile glow like a jewel against the workshop's concrete floor. What had begun as a curious auction purchase had transformed into something far more meaningful than either of them could have imagined. Brian nodded, remembering the shock of finding those letters, the photographs, the hidden history beneath the seats. "Your grandfather built something that lasted," he replied. "Not just the car, the story behind it." Evelyn dabbed at her eyes with her sleeve, careful not to smudge her mascara. "I never thought I'd feel close to him again. I was so young when he passed." She ran her hand over the dashboard, feeling the connection to a past she'd nearly lost. "Thank you for not giving up on this old girl." "Some things are worth saving," Brian said simply. The restoration had cost more than he'd initially budgeted, taken longer than expected. But watching Evelyn's face now made every late night worth it. She put the car in drive, easing forward slightly before stopping. "Would you like to come for the maiden voyage? First drive deserves a witness, don't you think?" Brian hesitated only a moment before walking around to the passenger side. The door opened with that solid, satisfying thunk that only vintage cars seem to possess. As he settled into the seat, the leather creaked welcomingly beneath him. They pulled out of the garage and onto the street, the Cadillac floating over the pavement like a boat on calm waters. Neighbors stopped to stare, some waving appreciatively at the rolling piece of history. Brian glanced over at Evelyn, noticing how naturally she handled the car, as if some genetic memory had been activated. "Where to?" he asked. Evelyn smiled, sunlight catching the tears still clinging to her lashes. "Just forward," she answered. That's where Grandpa would want us to go." As the Cadillac glided down the street, Brian leaned back in his seat, feeling oddly content. He'd restored many vehicles in his career, but this one had restored something in him too. A reminder that sometimes the most extraordinary journeys begin with the turn of a single key.